When the shipping container was placed on the desolate land in Montana, it didn't look like a home. It looked more like a steel tomb. But for Raymond Cooper and his dog Gunner, this was their fortress. A veteran fleeing the ghosts of war, he wasn't seeking comfort. He was seeking absolute silence. He believed that if he could lock the world out, he could also lock his horrifying memories in. However, on the very first night, as the heavy steel door boomed shut, he realized a terrifying truth. The silence he craved wasn't a cure, it was a mirror, reflecting all the ghosts he had tried to bury. Will this fortress be his salvation, or will it become the prison that holds him forever? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The rumble of the old Ford's engine was the only sound to break the immense silence. Raymond gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had been driving for nearly 3 days, heading west, leaving behind the clamor of cities, the crush of crowded roads, and the memories he desperately sought to bury. Beside him in the passenger seat, Gunner sat erect, his pointed ears twitching, his intelligent amber eyes scanning the shifting landscape. A 5-year-old German shepherd, whose thick coat was a striking blend of silver gray and white. Gunner showed no restlessness. He was simply present, a steady and silent force, as constant as the distant mountains. Montana greeted them not with a warm embrace, but with a sharp, cold wind that swept across the dry grasslands. The sky was terrifyingly vast, a deep blue dome without a single cloud, making a man feel small and exposed. This was exactly what Raymond had been looking for. The emptiness, a silence so profound you could hear the blood pulsing in your own ears. The truck turned onto a rough dirt road, groaning in protest as it navigated the ruts. At the end of the road lay his land. There was nothing there but a few stunted pine trees and the raw, untamed wilderness. To anyone else, it was the middle of nowhere. To Raymond, it was a sanctuary. He was a man built for this landscape, tall and lean, with a wiry strength that spoke of a life of physical hardship. At 40, Raymond Cooper's face was a map of his past. Short brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and a neatly trimmed but full beard covered a stubborn jaw. His features were rugged, carved by sun and worry, yet his deep-set hazel eyes held a quiet kindness that he rarely let anyone see. He wore a faded navy and gray plaid shirt over a plain charcoal t-shirt, the fabric worn soft with use. A few hours later, a specialized flatbed truck fitted with a powerful crane arm rumbled up the path, carrying his new home. It was not a charming mobile home or a cozy log cabin. It was a 40-foot shipping container, its dull green paint scarred with the dents and scrapes of long sea voyages. As the crane carefully lowered the steel box onto the patch of ground Raymond had leveled, he felt a cold, deep satisfaction. He had bought it with nearly the last of his savings, not out of desperation, but for its design. A container was built to withstand storms, to keep the outside world out. It was a fortress, a bunker. The driver, a portly man with a bushy beard, wiped sweat from his brow. "Your road is a real challenge," he said, his voice booming in the quiet. Almost gave up at that last turn. Raymond simply nodded, handing the man the signed paperwork and the last of the cash. He did not want conversation. Words were bridges, and other people used them to walk into your world. He had spent the last several years burning every bridge he could find. When the truck departed, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, the true silence descended. Raymond stood for a long moment, one hand resting on Gunner's head. He did a slow 360-degree scan of his surroundings, a habit baked into his bones. The mountain peaks to the west, the pine forest to the north, the empty dirt road to the south. No visible threats. He opened the heavy steel doors of the container, the shriek of the hinges echoing in the vastness. The inside was a hollow cavern, smelling of old steel and the faint, salty tang of the ocean. He began to unload his truck with the methodical precision of a soldier establishing a base. A military-style cot, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a small portable gas stove. Behind the truck, 6 large blue plastic barrels full of fresh water were carefully tied down. In a corner of the container, a chemical camping toilet stood as a practical reminder of off-grid life. Everything had been planned, every item essential. There was nothing sentimental, nothing to connect him to a past he was trying to erase. He ate his dinner of canned beans in silence, the only other sound the soft crunching of Gunner's kibble. The only light came from a small storm lantern, which cast dancing shadows on the corrugated steel walls. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that whipped around the container. When he lay down on the cot, placing his Beretta M9 pistol, a familiar companion from his time in service, on the floor beside him, the real battle began. Raymond's demon was the silence itself. In the absolute quiet, other sounds began to rise from the depths of his memory. The shriek of metal, the roar of an explosion, the frantic, chopped rhythm of helicopter blades. Faces flashed behind his closed eyelids, eyes wide with fear. He sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, a cold sweat beating on his forehead. He wasn't in the desert. He was in Montana, in a steel box. He repeated it to himself over and over, a desperate mantra against the tide of memory. Gunner let out a soft whine and moved closer, resting his heavy head on the edge of the cot. His warm breath washed over Raymond's hand. Raymond tangled his fingers in the dog's thick fur, grounding himself in the simple, living presence beside him. Gunner did not judge. He did not ask questions. He was just there, a steadfast anchor in the storm of Raymond's mind. The dog's solid weight and steady breathing pulled him back to the present, inch by painful inch. Raymond lay back down, but he did not sleep. He listened. He listened to the wind shrieking outside his fortress. He listened to the even, rhythmic breathing of his lone companion. He listened to the frantic beat of his own heart as it slowly, gradually returned to a normal rhythm. The first night in his new home was a long, vigilant watch. He was on guard, not against an enemy without, but against the prisoner within. When the first pale rays of dawn finally pierced the darkness, they illuminated a man sitting against the wall, exhausted but awake. Beside him, his dog opened his eyes, ready for a new day. They had survived the first night. Here, at the edge of the world, their war had just begun. Dawn in the high country did not arrive gently. It shattered the darkness, spilling cold, white light across the landscape and casting long, sharp shadows from the mountains. For Raymond, it was a summons. Before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, he was outside the container, the frigid air a shock to his system. This was the beginning of the rhythm, the ironclad routine that had kept him sane in places far more dangerous than this. First came the perimeter check. With Gunner trotting silently at his heel, he made a slow, deliberate circle around the container. His eyes, trained to spot disturbances, scanned the ground for unfamiliar tracks, his gaze sweeping the sparse tree line for anything out of place. There was nothing, only the tracks of a deer that had passed in the night and the silent judgment of the wilderness. Satisfied, he moved to the second phase of his morning, physical exertion. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups from a sturdy pine branch, each movement precise and controlled, pushing his body until the physical burn quieted the noise in his head. The final part of the ritual was for Gunner. It was not play, but training. Raymond used a series of sharp, quiet hand signals, commands Gunner obeyed with instant, focused intensity. Stay, come, watch. The dog moved with a fluid grace, his powerful body a study in controlled energy. This daily drill was their language, a silent conversation that reaffirmed their bond. For Raymond, it was a connection to the only part of his military life he missed, the uncomplicated loyalty and shared purpose he'd had with his canine partners. Gunner was not just a pet, he was his unit, his partner. the one soul he trusted without reservation. After their Spartan breakfast of oatmeal for him and kibble for Gunner, they began the day's main task, exploring their territory. As a former combat engineer, Raymond could not simply live on a piece of land. He had to know it. He needed to understand its weaknesses, its resources, its very bones. They walked the property line, a multi-hour trek over uneven, rocky ground. He noted the dry creek bed that might flow with water in the spring, the game trails that cut through the underbrush, the natural shelters formed by rock outcroppings. He was mentally mapping every feature, assessing the terrain with a professional eye. This land was his new theater of operations, and he intended to be its master. It was during one of these patrols that they climbed a low ridge at the far western edge of his property. The vantage point offered a commanding view of the surrounding valley, and it was from here that he saw it for the first time, his neighbor's ranch. It was a proper homestead with a modest wooden house, a large barn, and a spiderweb of fences corralling a herd of cattle. It looked like a world away from his solitary steel box. A lone figure was working near one of the fence lines, wrestling a new post into the hard ground. Even from this distance, Raymond could see the efficiency and strength in the person's movements. It was a woman. She was dressed for hard work in jeans, a thick jacket, and a worn hat that hid her hair. He guessed she was in her late 30s, with a sturdy, capable build, not slender, but strong. She moved with a tireless purpose, her entire focus on the task at hand. There was no one else around. She was completely alone, a solitary sentinel in her own vast kingdom. The sight of her sent a jolt of unease through Raymond. Another person, a variable he could not control. His instinct, honed by years of avoiding contact, took over. He took a half-step back, pulling himself into the shadow of a large pine, his body automatically seeking cover. He had not been seen. But he was wrong. Down in the valley, the woman, Abigail, suddenly stopped her work. She did not look up because of a sound, but because of a feeling, the primal instinct that tells you when you are being watched. She slowly straightened up, her hand still resting on the fence post, and her head turned, her gaze sweeping the distant ridge. Her posture, even from a quarter-mile away, was one of profound and ingrained caution. She stood perfectly still for a full minute, a statue of vigilance, her eyes scanning the exact spot where he and Gunner were concealed. Raymond held his breath, his own body rigid. Finally, she gave a slight shake of her head, as if dismissing a fleeting thought, and returned to her work, but the rhythm of her movements was different now, more guarded, less relaxed. The silent, invisible line between their two worlds had been drawn. Later that afternoon, back at the container, Raymond was attempting to rig a simple tarp awning to provide some shelter from the relentless sun. The Montana wind, however, had other plans. A sudden, violent gust ripped through the small clearing, tearing the tarp from his hands. It flapped wildly before a corner of it caught a loose piece of corrugated sheet metal he had leaning against the container. The wind lifted the metal sheet, flipping it through the air before it slammed back down onto the rocky ground. The sound was a deafening metallic crash. Clang! For Raymond, the world dissolved. The scent of pine and dust was instantly replaced by the acrid smell of cordite and hot metal. The cold wind on his face became the searing heat of a desert sun. The sound of the wind was lost in a cacophony of shouting, the roar of an engine, and the high-pitched whine of stressed metal. He was no longer in Montana. He was somewhere else, a place of sand and fire, crouched beside a burning Humvee, the world a blur of smoke and chaos. He staggered back, his hands flying up to cover his ears, a guttural noise escaping his throat. His breath came in ragged, panicked gasps. The container, his fortress, vanished, replaced by shattered walls and twisted steel. Then he felt a wet, insistent pressure on his hand. A soft whine cut through the phantom noises of the past. He looked down. Gunner was there, pressing his solid body hard against Raymond's legs, his tail tucked low, his amber eyes wide with concern. The dog licked his hand, once, twice, a rough, warm anchor in the swirling vortex of memory. Raymond focused on the sensation, on the feeling of the dog's thick fur beneath his trembling fingers, on the sound of his quiet, anxious whimpers. Slowly, painfully, the smell of cordite faded, replaced by the clean scent of pine. The roar of explosions subsided, leaving only the lonely howl of the wind. He collapsed to his knees, wrapping his arms around Gunner's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. He stayed there for a long time, his body shaking, while his loyal partner stood like a rock, absorbing the tremors of a war that refused to end. Several weeks settled into a predictable, monastic rhythm. The days were marked by the sun's solemn journey across the vast sky, the nights by the profound, ringing silence of the wilderness. Raymond's world had shrunk to the exact dimensions of his property, his interactions limited to the silent language he shared with Gunner. The rigid discipline of his routine was a bulwark against the chaos in his mind. Each sunrise was a small victory, each sunset a truce. Their afternoon patrols were the cornerstone of this rhythm. They would trace the familiar perimeter, Gunner trotting a few feet ahead, his senses alive to the world in a way Raymond's no longer were. He was the early warning system, the scout. But his movements were always economical, his presence always calm. He was not a dog given to frivolous barking or chasing squirrels. His focus was always on Raymond, a silent guardian watching over his troubled master. It was on one such afternoon, as they walked the path near the western ridge, that the rhythm broke. The area was unremarkable, a stretch of rocky ground dotted with sagebrush and the dark, collapsed maw of an old, abandoned mine shaft, its timbers rotten and sagging. Gunner, who was trotting ahead, stopped abruptly. He froze mid-stride, his head cocked, his body a tense line of focused energy. A low growl, a sound so deep it was more of a vibration, rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Raymond murmured, his hand instinctively moving closer to the pistol on his hip. He scanned the area. A coyote? A snake? He saw nothing. But Gunner was not looking at the horizon. He was looking at the ground, just a few yards from the treacherous edge of the old mine. He took a few stiff-legged steps forward, his nose twitching, and then began to bark. It was not his usual alert bark. This was a sharp, frantic, and insistent sound that echoed strangely in the quiet air. "Gunner, heel!" Raymond commanded, his voice low and firm. For the first time since they had arrived in Montana, the dog disobeyed. He ignored the command completely, his attention utterly captivated by something in the dirt. He pawed at the ground, then began to dig, his powerful front legs sending clumps of dry soil and stones flying. "Hey, knock it off," Raymond said, stepping closer. "There's nothing there." Gunner only dug faster, his entire body trembling with a strange excitement. Raymond's annoyance began to curdle into curiosity. He had seen Gunner on the trail of 100 animals. He had seen him alert to threats both real and imagined. He had never seen him like this. This was not the behavior of a dog tracking prey. This was an obsession, a frantic, desperate need to unearth something. Trusting the instincts of his partner over his own eyes, Raymond fell silent and watched. The dog dug for several minutes, his breathing coming in ragged pants, the hole growing steadily deeper. Finally, with a triumphant yelp, he plunged his head into the hole and pulled back, a small, dark object clamped gently in his jaws. He trotted over to Raymond and dropped it at his feet. It was not a bone or a rock. It was a small leather pouch, so old and saturated with damp earth that it was nearly black. It looked ready to crumble into dust at the slightest touch. Raymond knelt, a strange feeling of reverence settling over him. He ran a gentle finger over the surface. The leather was brittle and cracked. Whatever it was, it had been buried here for a very long time. "What did you find, huh?" he whispered, giving Gunner a deep scratch behind the ears. He picked up the pouch with the careful hands of an engineer disarming a bomb. It was surprisingly heavy. He carried it back to the container, Gunner trotting proudly beside him, his tail held high. The outside world, which Raymond had worked so hard to keep at bay, had just been brought inside, carried in the jaws of his own dog. Back in the sterile silence of his fortress, he sat at the small table he'd built from scrap wood. He laid the pouch on the clean surface and studied it under the light of his lantern. It was stitched with a thick, crude thread that had mostly rotted away. With painstaking care, he worked a finger under the flap, and the leather gave way with a soft, sighing tear. Inside, nestled in a bed of dirt and decayed lining, was a silver locket. It was tarnished a deep, ugly black, but its shape was unmistakable, a simple, heavy oval about the size of a quail's egg. He tipped it out into his palm. It felt cold and solid, a dense piece of someone else's history. There was no chain. For the rest of the afternoon, he worked on the locket. He used a small amount of his precious water and a soft corner of an old t-shirt, rubbing gently, methodically. Slowly, like a developing photograph, the tarnish began to recede. The dull black gave way to a soft, milky gray, and then, finally, to the unmistakable deep glow of old silver. As the metal became clean, he saw the engravings. They were elegant, cursive letters, worn smooth by time. On the front, a single initial, A.A. He felt a strange jolt, the name of his wary neighbor Abigail, flashing in his mind, but he dismissed it as coincidence. He found the tiny clasp and, using the tip of his pocket-knife, carefully pried it open. The inside was meant to hold 2 small photographs, but they were long gone, disintegrated into nothing but faint, ghostly stains on the silver. But on the left-hand side, beneath where a picture once sat, there was another inscription, smaller and more delicate. A name, and beneath it, a date. Amelia. August 1978. Raymond sat back, the locket resting in his open palm. The silence of the container seemed to deepen, to grow heavier. He was a man who ran from his own past, who fought daily to keep his own memories locked away. Now he held a key to someone else's. Amelia. Who was she? What had happened to her in August of 1978? And how did her story end here, buried in the dirt next to a forgotten mine? He looked over at Gunner, who was watching him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. The dog had not just dug up a piece of metal. He had dug up a ghost, a question that could not be ignored. The locket on the table was no longer just an object. It was a summons, a mission. And it was a direct threat to the fragile peace Raymond had fought so hard to build. The locket sat on the table, a small circle of silver that seemed to absorb all the light in the container. For a full day, Raymond did nothing. He went through his rigid routine, the perimeter check, the exercises, the training drills with Gunner. But his movements were automatic, his mind elsewhere. Every few minutes his eyes would be drawn back to the object. It felt like a violation, a piece of shrapnel from another life, lodged in the heart of his sanctuary. It was a story that demanded an ending, and Raymond wanted no part of it. His own story was a ruin he was trying to wall off. To take on someone else's felt like an impossible burden. The simplest solution, the one that screamed at him from the deepest part of his desire for isolation, was to make it disappear. Erase the discovery. Return to the silence. On the second morning, he made his decision. He picked up the locket, its weight feeling heavier than before, and grabbed the small entrenching tool he kept by the door. He would take it back to the mine, dig a deep hole, and bury it so thoroughly that no one, not even a dog as determined as Gunner, would ever find it again. Mission over. Fortress secure. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, the cool metal of the locket in his fist. Gunner was waiting for him as always, but this time the dog was not looking at the tree line or sniffing the air. He was sitting on his haunches, watching Raymond, his head tilted slightly. His intelligent amber eyes were fixed not on the tool in Raymond's hand, but on the fist that held the locket. There was no judgment in the dog's gaze, only a calm, unwavering watchfulness. It was the same look he gave when Raymond issued a command, an expression of profound and patient expectation. Raymond stopped. He looked from the locket to the dog. Gunnar had found this. For some reason beyond Raymond's understanding, he had been compelled to dig it up and bring it to him. To bury it now would be a betrayal of that strange, unspoken trust. It felt like abandoning a post, like failing a mission. A sense of duty, ingrained in him so deeply that it was more instinct than thought, warred with his desperate need for solitude. He had found something that was lost, and lost things, according to the code he had once lived by, were meant to be returned. With a low curse directed at himself, at the dog, at the world, he turned around and strode back into the container. He placed the locket carefully in his pocket and grabbed the keys to his truck. The silence had been broken, and there was no going back. The drive to the town of Sparrow Creek was a journey through escalating levels of anxiety. For weeks, the only signs of human life had been the distant figure of Abigail and the occasional high-altitude jetliner. Now, the empty dirt road gave way to gravel. Mailboxes began to appear, lonely sentinels marking hidden driveways. Then came the first houses, set far back from the road, curls of smoke rising from their chimneys. With each one, the knot in Raymond's stomach tightened. He parked on a quiet side street at the edge of the small town, beneath the shade of a large cottonwood tree. Sparrow Creek was little more than a main street with a dozen single-story wooden buildings, a gas station, a small grocery store, and a bar. But to Raymond, it felt like a metropolis. The air was filled with sounds, the slam of a screen door, the murmur of voices from the store's porch, the sudden roar of a pickup truck starting up. Every noise was a potential threat, every person a pair of judging eyes. He turned to Gunnar, who was watching him intently from the passenger seat. "Watch the truck," Raymond commanded, his voice rough from disuse. He felt a surge of vulnerability as he stepped out of the vehicle, leaving his partner behind. He was alone, exposed, walking into enemy territory. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement as he walked towards the largest building on the street, which had a faded sign that read, "Sparrow Creek Hardware and Repair." A bell chimed faintly as he pushed the heavy wooden door open. The inside smelled of oil, old wood, and dust. It was a cavern of organized chaos, with shelves overflowing with tools, plumbing supplies, and farming equipment. At the back of the shop, a woman was leaning over the exposed engine of a tractor, a wrench in her hand. She looked up as he entered, her eyes sharp and assessing. This was Clara. She was a woman in her late 50s, her graying hair tied back in a practical ponytail that had mostly escaped its confines. She wore grease-stained blue coveralls over a thermal shirt, and her hands, though grimy, were strong and competent. There was a no-nonsense intelligence in her face, a look that said she had seen and fixed just about everything. "Help you with something?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. Raymond felt his throat tighten. He had not had a real conversation with a stranger in months. He walked to the counter, cleared his throat, and simply placed the silver locket on the worn wooden surface. Clara wiped her hands on a rag and picked it up, her curiosity piqued. She turned it over, her thumb rubbing the engraved initial. "Well now," she said, her tone softening slightly. "This is a piece of history. Haven't seen silverwork like this in a long time." "I found it on my property," Raymond said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Clara's sharp eyes flicked up to his face. "You're the fellow who bought the old Johnson place, up by the ridge?" Raymond just nodded. She looked back at the locket, her brow furrowed in thought. "Johnson Place," she mused, more to herself than to him. Before them, it belonged to the Garretts. For generations, she held the locket up to the light, squinting at the faint inscription inside. Her expression changed, a flicker of recognition, then sadness. The Garretts had a tragedy. A long time ago, before my time even, but people still talk about it. They had a little girl who went missing, disappeared up near that old mine shaft on the property back in the late 1970s. She gently placed the locket back on the counter. Her name was Amelia. The name landed in the quiet shop with the force of a physical blow. Clara looked at Raymond, her gaze direct and full of a new understanding. "The only Garrett left around here is their niece, Abigail," she said. "She owns the ranch next door to you now. She inherited what was left of the family land." She tapped a finger on the locket. "If this belonged to who I think it did, then it belongs to her." The drive from Sparrow Creek to Abigail's ranch was only a few miles, but for Raymond, it felt like 100. He had just endured the gauntlet of the town, and now he was willingly walking into a direct confrontation. It went against every instinct he had honed for years. His hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and the small, heavy weight of the locket in his pocket felt like a brand. This was a mistake. He should have buried it. He saw the turnoff for her ranch, marked by a simple wooden sign with the name Garrett, barely visible under layers of faded paint. He slowed the truck and pulled over to the side of the road, just before the gate. The engine idled for a long moment as he stared at the entrance to her world. A simple barbed wire fence stretched out in both directions, a clear line between his property and hers, between his isolation and her life. Gunner, sensing his master's tension, shifted in the passenger seat and nudged Raymond's arm with his wet nose. Raymond looked at him, at the unwavering loyalty in those amber eyes, and took a deep, steadying breath. He was here because of the dog. He would see it through. He killed the engine, and the silence rushed back in, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. He sat for another minute, a soldier planning his approach. Keep it short, state the facts, deliver the objective, retreat. It was a simple mission plan, but his heart hammered against his ribs as if he were preparing to walk through a minefield. Finally, he got out of the truck, leaving Gunner to watch from the window. He walked slowly towards the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't touch the latch, respecting the clear boundary it represented. He simply stood there and waited, a solitary figure in the vast, empty landscape. He didn't have to wait long. A door slammed in the distance, and a figure emerged from the porch of the ranch house. It was her, Abigail. She walked towards him not with the casual gait of someone greeting a visitor, but with the purposeful, ground-eating stride of someone confronting a threat. As she drew closer, he could see her clearly for the first time. She was a woman shaped by the land she worked, her body lean and strong, without an ounce of softness. Her face, framed by dark brown hair pulled back in a severe practical ponytail, was weathered by the sun and wind. Fine lines radiated from the corners of her sharp, intelligent blue eyes, eyes that were currently narrowed with undisguised suspicion. She was wearing dusty jeans, scuffed work boots, and a denim jacket that had seen better days. In her right hand, she carried a heavy steel crowbar, holding it loosely, but in a way that made it clear she knew how to use it. She stopped about 10 feet short of the gate, on her side of the fence. The silence stretched, thick with tension. "This is private property," she said, her voice as hard and unyielding as the landscape around them. It was not a question. It was a warning. "State your business and move on." Raymond's own voice felt rusty, a machine that hadn't been properly used in years. He had to clear his throat before he could speak. "My name is Raymond Cooper. I own the land next door." Her expression didn't change. The information did nothing to soften her stance. "I know who you are," she stated flatly. "That doesn't answer my question." This was it, the point of no return. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it in his open palm so she could see it. "My dog found this," he said, his words clipped and factual. He kept his tone even, professional, betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. "On my property, near the entrance to the old mine." Her eyes flicked down to the locket, and for the first time, her rigid composure faltered. A barely perceptible flicker of emotion, shock, confusion, something else he couldn't name, crossed her face before being quickly suppressed. Her gaze shot back up to his, now colder and sharper than before, as if he were performing some kind of cruel trick. Raymond did not try to cross the fence. He did not ask her to take it. He simply leaned forward and carefully placed the small silver oval on top of the thick wooden gatepost that marked the corner of her property. It sat there between them, a relic from a forgotten time, a bridge across the divide. "Clara, in town, thought it might belong to your family," he finished, his mission complete. And then he did the one thing she clearly did not expect. He said nothing more. He gave a slight formal nod, turned his back on her, and walked away. He did not wait for a thank you. He did not wait for questions or accusations. He got back in his truck, started the engine, and drove away without a single backward glance. Abigail stood frozen, the crowbar still held tightly in her hand. She watched the dusty Ford pickup disappear down the road, her mind struggling to process the brief, bizarre encounter. The man was a ghost, a recluse. The whole town whispered about the strange veteran who lived in a shipping container. She had expected him to be dangerous, or at least unstable, but he had been quiet, respectful, and oddly formal. He had breached her perimeter only to return something, and then had retreated without asking for anything in return. Her eyes were drawn to the gatepost, to the glint of silver under the harsh Montana sun. She hesitated for a moment, then walked slowly towards it, her boots raising small puffs of dust. With a hand that trembled slightly, she reached out and picked up the locket. It was warm from the sun, but a different kind of coldness seemed to emanate from the metal itself, a chill that traveled up her arm and settled deep in her chest. She recognized it instantly from old family photographs. She turned it over and over in her palm, her thumb tracing the initial A. With trembling fingers, she opened the clasp. Amelia. August 1978. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the fence post for support, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up, staring at the empty road where the stranger had disappeared, and then back down at the impossible object in her hand. The ghost of a little girl lost decades ago, and the strange, solitary man who had brought her home. Her carefully constructed wall of hostility crumbled, replaced by a turbulent sea of confusion, grief, and 1,000 unanswered questions. For 2 days after the encounter at the fence line, an uneasy truce settled over the valley. Raymond kept to his property, the silver locket now tucked away in a small wooden box, a ghost he had delivered but could not entirely exorcise. He saw Abigail from a distance, a tireless figure moving about her ranch, but he made no effort to approach her again. His mission was complete. The balance he hoped had been restored. On the 3rd day, the world changed. The crisp autumn air, which had been clear and cold, grew heavy and still. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, transformed into a flat, oppressive ceiling of bruised gray clouds. Raymond, ever watchful, recognized the signs. He had seen skies like this before in high-altitude environments. An early, violent snowstorm was coming. He spent the afternoon securing his small camp, tying down the loose tarp that had triggered his flashback and checking the seals on his container door. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to rise, carrying the first stinging ice crystals on its breath. By nightfall, the storm hit with the force of an artillery barrage. A blinding wall of white descended upon the valley, erasing the landscape. The wind howled like a starving wolf, shrieking and tearing at the steel walls of the container. Inside, Raymond felt the deep, penetrating cold begin to seep through the metal. His only source of heat was a small, portable propane heater, a single blue flame fighting a losing battle against the Arctic assault. He and Gunnar huddled close to it, the dog's thick fur a welcome insulation against the drafts that snaked across the floor. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, the heater's steady hiss faltered. It sputtered once, twice, and then died. The blue flame vanished, plunging the container into absolute darkness and a sudden, profound cold. Raymond's breath plumed in the frigid air. The propane line had frozen. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a physical presence, a predator. The steel box, his fortress, had become an icebox. He moved quickly, his actions guided by training and instinct. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned, his fingers growing stiff and clumsy. He unrolled his military-grade sleeping bag, a relic from his service, and laid it out on the cot. "In," he commanded, his voice a low growl. Gunnar, shivering slightly, understood immediately. The dog climbed onto the cot and curled into a tight ball. Raymond zipped the bag up around them both, a cramped and awkward arrangement. But in the suffocating darkness, he could feel the steady, living heat radiating from the dog's body. He wrapped his arms around Gunnar, his face buried in the dog's thick ruff, and listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the storm raged, but inside their shared cocoon, two solitary beings fought back the cold together. From the window of her warm ranch house, Abigail watched the blizzard consume the world. She had lived in Montana her whole life. She knew the brutal, unforgiving nature of these early storms. They were killers, catching livestock and ill-prepared people by surprise. Her gaze kept drifting towards the ridge where the container sat, now completely invisible in the swirling maelstrom of snow. The man, Raymond Cooper, was a ghost, a puzzle. He had brought back a piece of her family's deepest tragedy and then vanished, asking for nothing. She was still reeling from the encounter, the locket now resting on her mantelpiece, a constant silent accusation. But as the storm intensified, her personal turmoil was overshadowed by a more ancient and fundamental law, the law of survival. She had seen the thin wisp of smoke that occasionally came from the makeshift stovepipe he had rigged, but for the last hour there had been nothing. In this weather, a lack of smoke was a death sentence. She told herself it was none of her business. He was a grown man, a veteran. He could take care of himself. But the image of his quiet, haunted eyes stayed with her. He was a stranger, but he was also her only neighbor. In the high country, that word meant something. With a frustrated sigh, she pulled on her heavy winter gear. This was not about kindness. It was about the code. You did not let a person freeze to death on your doorstep, no matter who they were. She went to the barn and wrestled a heavy-duty kerosene heater off a shelf along with a full 5-gallon can of fuel. She loaded them into the bed of her powerful 4-wheel drive truck. The drive, though short, was a treacherous battle against deep drifts and zero visibility. She followed the fence line, the posts barely visible in the swirling snow, until she reached his gate. She left the engine running, its headlights cutting 2 lonely beams into the blizzard. She unloaded the heater and the fuel can, her muscles straining against the weight and the force of the wind. She carried them to the door of the container and set them down where he could not possibly miss them. She did not knock. She did not call out his name. The act itself was the only message that needed to be sent. She got back in her truck and disappeared into the white chaos from which she came. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under 2 feet of pristine, silent snow. When Raymond finally forced the container door open against a heavy drift, the first thing he saw was the heater. It was a solid, practical piece of equipment, its dark red paint a stark slash of color against the white landscape. Beside it sat the can of fuel. He stood there for a long moment, motionless, the impossibly bright sun glinting off the snow, making him squint. He understood immediately. There was only one person who could have left it. He felt a complex mix of emotions: shame at his own lack of preparation, confusion at the unsolicited help, and an overwhelming, unfamiliar sense of obligation. A debt had been incurred, and debts had to be paid. Later that day, after he had warmed the container and eaten, he saw her. She was struggling near her barn with the well pump, a complex piece of machinery that supplied water to her livestock. The storm had clearly damaged it. He watched as she fought with a large wrench, her frustration evident even from a distance. This was his chance. He gathered his own professional-grade toolkit, a collection he had maintained with military precision for over 20 years. He walked over to her property, not towards the house, but directly to the well pump. She saw him coming and straightened up, her expression wary, her hands on her hips. He did not speak. He simply pointed at the pump and raised an eyebrow in a silent question. She hesitated, then gave a curt, reluctant nod. For the next hour, Raymond worked. He moved with a quiet, focused competence that was mesmerizing to watch. His hands were sure and steady as he disassembled the frozen motor, cleared the lines, and replaced a cracked valve. He worked in complete silence, a surgeon operating on the heart of her ranch. Abigail watched from a distance, her initial suspicion slowly melting into a grudging respect. When he was finished, he reassembled the housing and flipped the main breaker. The pump whirred to life with a satisfying hum, and fresh water began to gush into the trough. His work done, Raymond packed his tools. He gave Abigail a single, brief nod, a mirror of her own gesture, and walked back to his property without a word. The debt had been paid. The balance was restored. But the foundation between them had shifted, settling into something new, something built not on words, but on the silent, shared language of survival. A week of quiet, cold peace settled over the two properties. The silent transactions of the heater and the water pump had forged a new, unspoken understanding between Raymond and Abigail. They were no longer just strangers. They were neighbors, bound by the unwritten laws of the high country. They kept their distance, respecting the invisible lines between their worlds, but the air of suspicion had been replaced by a neutral, watchful respect. Raymond found a strange comfort in this new dynamic. It was a relationship he could understand, one built on actions, not words. He was beginning to believe he could maintain this fragile equilibrium indefinitely. His days were his own, governed by his strict routine, and the nights, though still long, were becoming less of a battleground. He had his fortress, his dog, and a neighbor who seemed to understand the value of silence. It was almost enough. One night, the peace was shattered. Raymond was sitting at his small table, cleaning his pistol by the steady glow of a lantern, a ritual he performed every few days. Gunner was asleep at his feet, his paws occasionally twitching as he chased phantom rabbits in his dreams. The only sounds were the soft metallic click of the pistol's slide and the gentle whisper of the wind outside. Suddenly, Gunner was awake. He didn't just stir, he shot to his feet in a single, fluid motion, a low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. His ears were swiveled forward, his body rigid, the fur along his spine standing on end. He moved to the door of the container, his nose pressed against the narrow crack, sniffing the night air. Raymond froze, his hands still on the disassembled pistol. He watched the dog, his own senses instantly on high alert. This was not Gunner's usual reaction to a passing deer or a distant coyote. This was different. This was a threat alert. The growl escalated into a series of deep, chest-thumping barks. They were not frantic or panicked, but controlled, urgent, and directional. Gunner was not barking at the surrounding wilderness. He was barking directly east, towards Abigail's ranch. In seconds, Raymond was reassembling the pistol with practiced efficiency. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. If Gunner said there was a threat, There was a threat. He pulled on his sturdy work boots, grabbed a powerful, heavy-duty flashlight from its hook by the door, and slid a spare magazine into his pocket. "With me," he said in a low voice. They moved out into the moonless, star-dusted night. The air was bitingly cold. Instead of taking the easy path down the dirt road, Raymond cut directly across the rough, frozen terrain that separated his land from hers. He and Gunnar moved with a synchronized, ghostly silence, wraiths navigating the darkness. Raymond kept the flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust, relying on his night vision and Gunnar's superior senses to guide them. As they drew closer to Abigail's property, a faint distress sound reached them on the wind, the nervous bleating of a calf. Gunnar's growl deepened. They slowed their pace, moving from the cover of one sparse pine tree to the next. Raymond could now see the dark outlines of her barn and the cattle pens. It was near the pens, where the young, vulnerable calves were kept for the night, that the source of Gunnar's alarm became terrifyingly clear. There, perched on the top rail of the wooden fence, was the sleek, muscular silhouette of a mountain lion. It was a huge male, its long tail twitching almost lazily as it surveyed the panicked calves below. It was the apex predator of these mountains, a silent, efficient killer. It was patient, waiting for the right moment, for the weakest calf to separate from the small, terrified herd. Raymond's heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was cold and clear. His first instinct was to raise his pistol, to place a single, clean shot and end the threat. But he hesitated. He was not a hunter. He had taken lives in the desert because he had to, and the memory of every single one was a ghost that haunted him. He would not create a new ghost tonight if he could avoid it. This animal was only doing what nature designed it to do. But he also could not let it slaughter Abigail's livestock. He was a protector, not a killer. He scanned the area, his combat engineer's mind rapidly assessing his options. He needed a non-lethal solution, a deterrent. His eyes landed on a discarded 55-gallon oil drum lying on its side near a pile of scrap metal. An idea, born of battlefield improvisations, sparked in his mind. Noise and light, the two things a stalking predator hated most. He moved silently to the scrap pile, Gunnar sticking to his side like a shadow. He picked up a heavy length of rusted pipe. He waited, his breathing controlled, his focus absolute. The mountain lion gathered itself, its powerful hind legs coiling, preparing to leap down into the pen. Now. With all his strength, Raymond slammed the iron pipe against the side of the oil drum. The resulting sound was a deafening, explosive crash that shattered the night, a raw, metallic thunder that was utterly alien to the natural world. In the same instant, he thumbed the switch on his flashlight, sending a blindingly intense beam of white light directly into the cougar's face. The effect was instantaneous. The mountain lion, caught mid-crouch, was violently ripped from its predatory focus. Blinded by the light and deafened by the concussive noise, its wild instincts screamed danger. With a guttural snarl of fear and surprise, it abandoned its prey, leaping from the fence and vanishing into the darkness of the mountains like a phantom. The sudden, violent noise had done its job. A light flicked on in Abigail's house, and the back door was thrown open. She came running out, a high-powered rifle held at the ready, her face a pale mask of alarm in the dim light from the house. She arrived at the pens just as Raymond was lowering the flashlight, the echoes of the crash still ringing in the air. Her sharp eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Her terrified calves huddled in the far corner of the pen, the empty fence rail where the predator had been, and the silent man standing at the edge of her property. His dog, a grim statue at his side. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The story was written in the very air around them. She looked at Raymond, her rifle still held tightly, and for the first time, her expression was not one of suspicion or confusion, but of stark, unadulterated understanding. He had been watching over her. He gave her a single, short nod, then turned and melted back into the night, Gunner at his heels. The next morning, as the sun rose, Raymond stepped out of his container to begin his daily perimeter check. Sitting on the large, flat rock he used as a doorstep was a heavy package, neatly wrapped in white butcher paper and tied with string. He knew, without a doubt, who had left it. He carried it inside and unwrapped it. It was a large, prime cut of beef, more meat than he could eat in a week. There was no note. None was needed. It was not a gift. It was a tribute. It was payment for services rendered. It was the high country's way of saying thank you, an acknowledgement from one solitary survivor to another that they were no longer just neighbors. They were allies. The offering of meat was the last direct exchange. In the days that followed, the silence between the two properties returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer the tense, wary quiet of two strangers, but the comfortable, settled silence of allies who understood their respective territories. Raymond would see Abigail working her land, and she would see him reinforcing his container, and a quiet acknowledgement would pass between them, a shared understanding that they were both guardians of this lonely stretch of valley. Raymond had begun the slow, arduous process of turning his steel box into something resembling a home. Using his meager disability pension, he had bought a few rough-hewn timbers and was attempting to frame out an opening for a window, a small concession to the world outside. The work was slow, his tools limited. He was measuring a cut when the unfamiliar sound of an approaching engine made him freeze, his hand dropping to his side, near his pistol. Gunner was instantly on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest as a dusty, beat-up pickup truck rattled its way up the dirt track. It was Clara from the hardware store. She pulled to a stop a respectful distance from the container and got out, wiping her greasy hands on a rag. She took in the scene: Raymond's tense stance, the protective dog, the half-finished window frame, with her usual sharp, assessing gaze. "Don't get your hackles up, Cooper," she called out, her voice practical and devoid of any false friendliness. "I'm not here to socialize." She gestured to the back of her truck, where a large, complicated piece of machinery lay chained to the flatbed. "This is a hay baler. Belongs to Old Man Hemlock over on the East Fork. It's busted, and the nearest certified repairman is in Bozeman and won't be out for 3 weeks. Hay's already been cut. If it rains, he loses the whole crop." Raymond said nothing. He remained where he was, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Clara sighed, a small cloud of vapor in the cold air. "Look," she said, getting to the point. "I was talking to Abigail this morning. She came in for some fencing staples. I mentioned Hemlock's problem." Clara paused, letting her next words land with deliberate weight. "She said you know your way around an engine. Said you were a combat engineer." The words hit Raymond with a surprising force. Abigail. She had talked about him. More than that, she had vouched for him, given him a credential in the quiet, tight-knit world of Sparrow Creek. She had not just seen him as a strange recluse, she had seen his competence, his skill. She had given him a name other than the crazy veteran in the container. He was a man who could fix things. He looked from Clara's expectant face to the broken machine in her truck. It was a problem to be solved, a mission. This was a language he understood far better than small talk. He gave a single, curt nod. "I'll take a look at it," he said. It took him 4 hours of focused, methodical work, but he found the problem, a sheared pin in the main gearbox, a simple failure that had crippled the complex machine. He fabricated a replacement part from a hardened steel bolt in his own kit, installed it, and tuned the engine. When he was done, the baler hummed with a smooth, powerful rhythm. Clara watched the last part of his work, her expression one of deep professional respect. "I'll be," she muttered. Abigail was right. She looked around at his sparse setup. "What do you need?" "What?" Raymond asked, confused. "For the work," she clarified. "Hemlock will want to pay you. He's good for it. Cash, or is there something you need? Looks like you could use some decent lumber for that window." Raymond thought for a moment. Cash was complicated. It felt like a wage, a job, but a trade. That was different. That was the currency of this place. "Lumber," he said, "and insulation." The next day, a flatbed truck that was even older than Clara's arrived, driven by a weathered old rancher with a grateful expression who introduced himself as Hemlock. He didn't try to shake Raymond's hand or engage in conversation. He simply unloaded a tall stack of high-quality, milled lumber and a dozen thick rolls of fiberglass insulation. He nodded his thanks and left. Word of the quiet, efficient mechanic on the ridge spread through Sparrow Creek with the speed of a grass fire. In the weeks that followed, a slow but steady stream of visitors made their way up Raymond's track. They were all the same, practical, self-reliant people with a problem they couldn't solve. A farmer with a broken water pump, a rancher with a generator that wouldn't start, a logger with a malfunctioning chainsaw. They all respected his silent boundaries. They never approached the container directly, but waited by their vehicles until he came out. The conversations were brief, focused entirely on the mechanics of the problem at hand, and the payment was always in trade. He acquired a sturdy cast-iron wood-burning stove, a stack of thermal pane windows salvaged from a renovation, bags of concrete, fresh vegetables, and enough venison and beef to last the winter. Slowly, without any conscious effort on his part, the walls of his fortress began to come down, replaced by the frame of a real home. And with each brief, focused interaction, a small, rusted part of his own humanity was being repaired. Throughout this time, his interactions with Abigail remained completely silent, but they were no less significant. She never came to him with a broken machine. Her support was quieter, more profound. One morning, he found a stack of perfectly seasoned oak planks at the fence line, the kind of fine-grained wood, ideal for building furniture. Another day, a heavy-duty box of roofing screws appeared in the same spot. There was never a note. She saw what he was building, identified what he needed, and provided it. Raymond, in turn, responded in the only way he knew how. He noticed her supply of firewood was dwindling as the days grew shorter and colder. He spent an entire afternoon with a chainsaw, felling a dead, standing pine on his property. He worked tirelessly, cutting the thick trunk into uniform lengths, splitting the logs with a heavy maul until his shoulders ached, and stacking them into a neat, solid cord. The next morning, before the sun was up, he transported the entire stack to her side of the fence line, a silent, monumental offering of warmth and labor. He was heading back to his container when she emerged from her house. She saw the huge stack of firewood, then looked across the field at him. She did not wave or call out. She simply raised her hand in a slow, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement. Raymond stopped and raised his own hand in response. For a long moment, they stood there, two solitary figures in the vast morning light, before each turned back to their own world, the silence between them now filled with a deep and abiding respect. As autumn bled its final colors onto the mountainsides and the first lasting snows began to dust the peaks, Raymond's work took on a new urgency. Winter in Montana was not a season to be trifled with, and a steel box was a poor shield against its fury. The materials he had earned through barter were stacked neatly beside the container, a testament to a community's quiet acceptance. Now it was time to build. What followed was a period of intense, focused labor. Every day from the first light of dawn until the encroaching dusk forced him to stop, Raymond worked. He was no longer just a man surviving, he was a creator, an engineer bringing a vision to life. He moved with a purpose that left no room for the ghosts of the past. The clean, logical problems of construction, of angles, measurements, and stress loads, were a soothing balm on his troubled mind. He started by cutting into the walls of his fortress, an act that felt both terrifying and liberating. With a screaming angle grinder that sent sparks flying into the cold air, he carved out openings for the thermal pane windows he had acquired. Each new opening let in a rectangle of precious light, chasing the permanent gloom from the corners of the container. He framed the interior with the lumber Hemlock had given him, creating a skeleton of a home inside the steel shell. Between the studs, he packed the thick fiberglass insulation, a bulwark against the coming cold. Gunner was his constant shadow, a silent supervisor who watched every action with rapt attention. He would lie just outside the container, his head on his paws, observing as Raymond wrestled with sheets of plywood to create an interior skin, his ears twitching at the sharp report of the nail gun. The dog seemed to understand the importance of the work, that this noisy, chaotic process was creating a place of warmth and safety for their small two-soul pack. The heart of the home was the cast-iron wood-burning stove. Raymond installed it with meticulous care, running the insulated stovepipe up through the container's roof and sealing it against the elements. The first time he lit a fire, the small stove ticked and pinged as it heated up, and a wave of deep, radiant warmth began to push back against the ever-present chill. Gunner moved from his spot by the door and curled up on the floor a few feet from the stove, letting out a long, contented sigh. For the first time, the container did not feel like a bunker. It felt like a hearth. The final exterior touch was a small, covered porch he built from the sturdiest timbers. It wasn't large, just big enough for 2 chairs and a stack of firewood, but it changed the character of the container completely. It was no longer just a box dropped in a field. It was a dwelling with a place to sit and watch the world, an invitation to the silence rather than a defense against it. With the main construction finished, the home was secure against the winter. But there was one last project, one final piece that felt more important than all the others. The interior was still rough, a collection of functional spaces. Raymond wanted to create something that was not just about survival, but about gratitude. He took out the stack of seasoned oak planks that Abigail had left for him at the fence line. The wood was beautiful, its grain straight and true. He had been saving it for something special. He chose the largest of the new windows, the one that faced east, looking out over the valley and Abigail's distant ranch. It was the window that caught the morning sun. Beneath this window, he began to build. He worked with a craftsman's care now, no longer a soldier fortifying a position, but an artist creating a piece of furniture. He measured and cut the oak planks, his hands shaping the wood with a gentle reverence. He built a wide, sturdy platform, a window seat deep enough for a large dog to stretch out comfortably. He sanded every surface until it was as smooth as polished stone, and then rubbed it with linseed oil, bringing out the wood's warm, honey-colored glow. The final touch was a cushion, which he fashioned from a folded, heavy-duty army blanket, its familiar olive drab a soft contrast to the warm wood. When he was finished, he stood back and admired his work. It was the finest thing in the small home. He didn't need to say anything. He simply gave the cushion a soft pat. Gunner, who had been watching the process with intense interest, walked over. He sniffed at the platform, placed one paw on it, and then gracefully hopped up. He turned 3 circles as dogs have done for millennia, and then settled down with a soft groan, his head resting on his paws as he gazed out the window. He was home. A few days later, the first heavy snow of winter arrived, blanketing the world in a thick, silent layer of white. The wood stove radiated a steady warmth through the small home, and the new windows offered a view of a landscape transformed and beautiful. Raymond felt a sense of peace that was so profound, it was almost unnerving. He had done it. He had built a home. The achievement felt incomplete, however, if unshared. He took a small piece of paper and a pencil. For the first time in years, he wrote a note to another human being. His handwriting was stiff and unfamiliar. The message was 5 simple words. The coffee is on. He put on his coat and boots and walked through the deep snow to the fence line, the cold air clean and sharp in his lungs. He tucked the note into a crack in the gatepost, where she would be sure to find it. The next afternoon, he saw a figure walking across the snow-covered expanse between their properties. It was Abigail. She was bundled in a heavy coat, her steps sure and steady in the deep snow. It was the first time she had ever willingly approached his home. Raymond's heart beat a little faster, but he did not feel the old panic. He simply put a fresh pot of coffee on the small gas burner. When she reached the porch, he was waiting at the open door. "I saw your note," she said, her breath pluming in the cold. "Coffee's ready?" he replied. He poured 2 mugs of the hot black coffee. He expected her to stay on the porch, but she surprised him by stepping inside, her sharp eyes taking in the small, warm space. She saw the insulated walls, the sturdy furniture, and her gaze lingered for a moment on Gunnar, who was peacefully asleep on his custom-built window seat. A flicker of a smile touched her lips. They didn't stay inside. They took their mugs and sat on the edge of the porch, their boots resting in the snow, the warmth of the coffee cups seeping into their cold hands. They sat in a comfortable, easy silence, watching the low afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the endless white landscape. There were 1,000 things they could have said, 1,000 questions that hung in the air between them about a locket, a mountain lion, and a family's tragic history. But the words were not necessary. The silence was no longer an empty space to be filled, but a shared understanding. They were 2 survivors, 2 solitary souls who had found not love, but something just as rare, a quiet, unconditional respect. And for now, in the heart of the vast, silent winter, it was more than enough. The brutal Montana winter finally broke its grip, retreating slowly up the mountainsides until only the highest peaks wore a crown of white. In its wake, it left a world reborn. The valley, once a silent expanse of snow, erupted in a riot of life. The grasslands turned a vibrant, impossible green, dotted with the bright yellows, purples, and blues of wildflowers. The creek bed that had been dry when Raymond arrived now gurgled with clear, cold meltwater. The air, once sharp and sterile, was now thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and alive with the cheerful, intricate songs of returning birds. Spring had come to Sparrow Creek, and with it, a new kind of peace had settled in Raymond's soul. He sat on his porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The morning sun was gentle on his face. He was no longer the haunted sentry of his first few months, a man constantly scanning for threats. He was simply a man on his porch, watching the day begin. His home, the once cold container, was now a snug and sturdy cabin, a testament to a winter of hard work. The wood stove was cold, its services no longer needed, and the windows were thrown open to let in the fresh spring air. At his feet, Gunnar lay sprawled in a patch of sun, his silver-gray coat gleaming, his tail giving a lazy thump against the wooden planks of the porch every now and then. Raymond's gaze drifted across the valley to the neighboring ranch. There, a familiar figure was moving along a fence line, her stride as steady and purposeful as ever. Abigail. He watched her for a moment, a feeling of quiet contentment settling over him. Their relationship had found its own unique rhythm, a pattern of silent exchanges and mutual respect that asked for nothing more than what it was. She would leave a basket of fresh eggs at the fence post, and he would leave a bundle of kindling. There were no words, no debts, only the simple, profound language of shared existence. As if sensing his gaze, she stopped her work and looked up, her eyes meeting his across the vast green expanse. There was no suspicion in her look, no tension. She simply raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Raymond raised his own hand in response. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they both turned back to their own lives, she to her fence, he to his coffee. The greeting was all that was needed, a simple affirmation of their shared space in the quiet dawn. He leaned his head back against the wall of his home and closed his eyes, letting the sun warm his face. He thought back to the man who had arrived here less than a year ago, a man so broken he had sought to build a fortress, not just against the world, but against himself. He had come seeking an ending, a final silent retreat from a life that had become too loud, too painful. He had believed that solitude was the only cure for the wounds he carried. He had been wrong. The flashbacks still came sometimes in the darkest hours of the night. The hypervigilance was still a part of him, a low hum of awareness that never truly switched off. But they no longer owned him. They were ghosts in a house he now knew intimately, familiar shadows he could acknowledge without letting them consume him. The fortress he had tried to build had failed. Its walls had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a dog's loyalty, by a community's practical kindness, by a neighbor's silent respect. He had found a place in the world again, not by changing who he was, but by being exactly who he was. The people of Sparrow Creek didn't need him to be friendly or sociable. They needed him to be competent, to be the man who could fix things. They had engaged with his skills, not his trauma, and in doing so, had given him a way back. They had allowed him to connect on his own terms through the simple, honest language of work. And Abigail. Theirs was a bond he could never have imagined, a friendship forged in silence and sustained by distance. She had never asked him about his past. She had never offered pity. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, a man freezing in the dark, and had responded not with emotion, but with a heater. She had seen him as a protector and had responded not with gushing thanks, but with a tribute of meat. She understood, in a way no one else ever had, that the greatest respect you could show a man like him was to honor his boundaries. She had given him the space to heal. He opened his eyes and looked at the world he had built. He had not lost himself in this new life. He had found himself. He had learned that connection did not have to be a surrender, that community did not have to be an invasion. He was still Raymond Cooper, the quiet veteran, the solitary man on the ridge. But he was no longer a prisoner. He was simply home. With a newfound sense of clarity, he stood up and walked inside. The interior was warm and smelled of coffee and cedar. Gunner lifted his head from his perch on the window seat, watched his master for a moment, and then settled back to sleep, content and secure. Raymond looked at the dog, his steadfast four-legged anchor, the catalyst for everything that had changed. He went to a small shelf where he kept a few books and a sparse collection of supplies. He took out a clean sheet of paper and a pen. He sat at the table where he had once cleaned a tarnished silver locket and stared at the blank page for a long time. There was one last bridge to build, one final ghost to face. He began to write. The letter was not to a stranger, but to his father, a retired Army colonel with whom he had not spoken in over 2 years. The silence between them had been one of pride, misunderstanding, and unspoken pain. Raymond did not write of the war. He did not write of the nightmares, the anxiety, or the long, slow crawl back to the light. There were no apologies for his long silence, no explanations for why he had run away. Instead, he wrote of the mountains. He wrote of the brutal beauty of the winter and the fierce, vibrant life of the spring. He described the process of building his home, the satisfaction of cutting a true line in a piece of wood, of raising a wall against the wind. He wrote about his dog, Gunner, about his quiet loyalty and his strange, uncanny wisdom. He described the taste of coffee on a cold morning and the way the sun lit up the valley at dawn. He was not describing his pain. He was describing his peace. He finished the letter with a final, simple sentence. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a demand for understanding. It was just an invitation, an open door. I thought you might like to see it sometime. He folded the paper, his movements calm and deliberate, and slid it into an envelope. His mission was complete. He had faced the wilderness outside and the wilderness within. He had survived. And in the wordless, peaceful dawn, he was finally ready to let the world back in. Sometimes the deepest conversations are the ones held in total silence. The journey of Raymond and Gunnar reminds us that even in the most desolate of places, the quiet loyalty of an animal can be the anchor that helps a lost soul find their way home. If their story of healing and courage touched your heart, every subscription and every share helps us bring more tales like this to light. We would be honored to read your own thoughts or stories of a faithful companion in the comments below. Our newest story has just appeared on the screen, and we invite you to continue the journey with us by giving it a click.